If you're planning to take your vehicle off-road, there are certain things you need. Tires, good suspension, ground clearance. But if you want the whole world to know that you're going off-road, you need a few more things. Lots of lights, high lift jack, gas cans everywhere, and of course, big, mean-looking metal bumpers. The bumpers also help with ground clearance, particularly your approach and departure. Since the Viper was never meant to go off-road, the approach angle is really bad, so I actually do need to chop off a bunch of the fascia, which I did last time. Now it looks kind of like a shark's nose, which isn't bad, but we can do better. We can add a front bumper that shows the whole world that I'm a real, genuine off-roading bro. The basic idea here is that I need to cover up this missing chin with something that is durable and that can bounce off of rocks from time to time. But it can't be too tall, it needs to stay out of the way so it doesn't make the ground clearance worse. It should have a toe point, preferably one that is strong enough to actually be used as a toe point. Ideally, it will conceal the fact that I've chopped off huge chunks of the front fascia. I could have cut this bumper higher, but I wanted to keep as much of that crosshair grille as possible since it's a big part of the Viper design. So I'll need to make a bumper that keeps that design a little bit and hopefully also allows some airflow since the Viper is notorious for overheating. So I drew up a quick bumper that has clearance for a good approach angle and follows the cut line of the fascia. And it's ugly. It's not good. Part of the problem is that the Viper is a very curvy, swoopy car, and off-road bumpers are faceted, sharp, and angry. I don't really want a curved, swoopy bumper, partly because I don't think it would look good, but also because it doesn't fit my preferred manufacturing style of welding up laser-cut metal. No, we will make this work. First, by adding a bull bar. My 4Runner bumper has one of these, and even though I've never actually used it for anything, it does look good. Not right now, it's rusted and faded and wet, but it used to look good. I also would like to hide the cut plastic parts of the front wheel arch, so I sketched in a bumper that has some extensions that come up the side, and I've made a beard. It's a beard. And while the ladies do love the beard, it looks stupid on a Viper, so I ditched it.
I don't need your fantasy women.
I'm not great at this. I'm not a designer. I don't have the designer's eye for things. I have the engineer's eye, and engineers, not good designers. When engineers get to design things, you get computers from the 90s. It is for this reason that I have decided to copy other people's designs. This sounds bad, but it's actually how pretty much everything is designed. So I looked around and found some cool looking things and went back to the drawing board. We really need to break up the monotony of the design. One obvious thing I can do is carve out parts of the bumper for the lower opening. This sort of continues that crosshair grille down into the bumper. I also added lights. All good bumpers need lights. One long one in the center and a couple of small amber ones on the outside. I originally did this design around some name brand off-road lights, but then I realized it would cost well over $1,000. Actually closer to $2,000 after tax. The ones I went with, $135. I'm sure the other ones are better. I'm sure they are not 10 times better. I also added removable panels in case I change my mind about the design or in case I want to add something else here in the future. I did this by having a perimeter that I'll weld onto the back that has holes in it that I will tap so the panels can be screwed in. I did try to shove a winch in here. The full-size ones were a definite no-go, but I could get a smaller one for a side-by-side and fit it in there with some careful packaging. It's pretty tight, and I might add one later by welding up a bracket to the intermediate bumper, but that comes later. In the interim, I will have to find a solution, like a come-along, or having friends. I sent off the CAD to my friends over at Send Cut Send for them to laser cut out. Usually with something like this, I'd put tabs and slots into the part so they locate nicely for welding, but that always makes the weld look weird when you get to the tab, so I didn't do it this time. What I did do is have Send Cut Send do some of the bending for me. They've had this service for a while, but I usually just do all flat pieces or do the bending myself. But I wanted several bends in this to make it look more simple. And now, if you use Fusion, you can draw your part in sheet metal and then just upload the STL, and Send Cut Send will automatically pull in the data about bend location and angles. Pretty sweet. The bends do require that you have a flat section that is parallel to the bend, so they have something to date them off of. That's why these parts look like this. I just jigsaw cut these off after I got the parts. By the way, you all know how much I love Send Cut Send, but an extra shout out to them today for supporting the channel with these parts. If you haven't started making everything in your life out of laser cut parts, you are missing out. It is the cheat code. I've done almost all of the modifications on this car with Send Cut Send. Anyway, I like this bump in the middle. It helps fill out the crosshair grille, but it doesn't really lend itself to bending. For one, the legs are really short, but there's also 3 of them that intersect. I could do 2 bends on the sides and maybe have a front bend come up from the bottom piece, or I could just have this be a separate piece entirely. But since I have a CNC router, the easy thing to do here was to actually just get a 3/4 inch block of aluminum and mill some angles onto it. I almost pocketed out the bottom for weight, but then I remembered I don't really care. Since I didn't add the tabs and slots, it was a little tough to get everything lined up, but I made it happen. To get the removable panels in the right spot, I tapped the backing plates and screwed the panels on, and I just kind of centered it by hand, clamped it down, and welded. Those amber side lights are held in with a little welded shelf. These worked out nicely, except that I welded one in upside down first and had to cut it out and re-weld it, but don't worry about that. I assembled this by doing a lot of small welds at first. I don't want it to warp and end up taco-shaped. It was a lot of welding, but it did mostly stay straight, except for this opening for the center light that needed some fine-tuning with a file. The bumper is also getting what are sometimes called Raptor lights. The Ford Raptor, both the F-150 and the Bronco versions, have these 3 lights mounted in the front grille. They're actually legally required on all vehicles that are more than 80 inches wide. But since Raptors are cool, this feature has made its way to other off-road vehicles that don't require them. You'll see them on 4Runners and Tacomas that are narrower than the required width. The Viper is a pretty wide car, and since I slapped in a solid rear axle with a higher offset wheels and wheel spacers, I am just barely wider than the 80-inch limit, so these are technically required for this car to be legal. The cutouts for these on the top bar were drawn in to be laser cut, but when you upload something like this to SendCutSend, they will warn you that having a feature really close to a bend could distort the feature. I like this. I like a place that warns you about your mistakes but lets you make them anyway. I went for it, just to see, and it came out a little weird. Thankfully, I also ordered a bar without the holes. Also, thankfully, I have access to a mill, so I chucked up a 3/8 end mill and cut some slots. These lights are actually turn signals for a motorcycle. They have a post mount that comes out of the side. This makes it really easy to mount them. I just welded in some little brackets that have the right size hole in them. I did make these slightly larger so I'd have enough clearance to rotate the light up and remove it after I welded the tab in. Sometimes I do have foresight. Since the posts are threaded, the distance from the bracket to the hole doesn't really matter. I also added another hole in the bracket to run the wires through. So I mentioned in a previous video that I made a kind of intermediate bumper. This bolts to the frame where the old fiberglass crash bumper used to mount, and I ran it down and back to the lower frame, drilled some holes, and bolted it in there. So it's pretty securely attached to the frame of the car. These toe mounts I talked about earlier, they're what actually mount the bumper to the car, kind of. That intermediate bumper has steel plates coming off of the front, and those toe mounts extend back through the bumper. In between is another steel plate bolted to both sides. So the tow hooks have a pretty direct path to the frame of the car. One of my friends mentioned to me that he wasn't sure about the strength of these guys since they're aluminum, but if I beef these up to be super strong, then the next weakest link is the actual frame of the car, which was never designed to be yanked out of a ditch with a kinetic recovery rope and a 6,000-pound Lexus. So we'll go with the 3/4 inch wide aluminum. Anyway, those steel brackets coming off of the intermediate bumper, I bolted them to the aluminum bumper and then located the aluminum bumper in space relative to the Viper and then welded them to the intermediate bumper. This was to make sure I got it in the right place, and it took a lot of fine-tuning, slight adjustments, all made easier with the QuickJack. QuickJack sent me one of their portable car lifts, pretty great for the kind of stuff I do on cars. I have a tendency to use these for things they're not exactly designed for, which should not be a surprise if you watch this channel. But in any case, they're pretty great, and they're getting a lot of use. So thank you to QuickJack. I'm sure you'll be seeing a lot of these in the future. Installing this bumper did require a lot of trimming. There is a cut line on the fascia that I trimmed to, and I designed the aluminum bumper to that line, but things just kind of moved around a little bit. The sides of the fascia are sagging a bit since I hacked away so much of that front end carrier, and the bumper itself moved around a little bit as I welded it, so there was some fine tuning. But eventually, it all fit. I painted the bumper with Steelit. This stuff is more expensive than most paint, but also less expensive than powder coating, and it held up pretty well in the land speed car frame, so we're going to give it a try here. The benefit over powder coat is that I can touch it up whenever I want, which is good because I haven't ground down the welds on this thing yet. Most off-road bumpers, in fact pretty much all of them, have the welds ground down so you can't see them. I'm not sure if I want to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and paint this, and if I change my mind, I can do it later. I got the lights mounted and wired in, making sure everything was nicely crimped, heat shrinked, and zip tied down. I'm finding a lot of good uses for my new 3D printer, trying to justify the expense and also make sure to use it in videos to be able to write it off on my taxes. I needed to securely route the wires coming from the top amber lights. You can buy little things for this, but part of the convenience of having a printer is that instead of waiting 2 days or driving to a store, I can have it now. Or like an hour from now. I drew up and designed a pad that used 2 zip ties for no particular reason, and then my printer decided to barf all over the place halfway through. But since I actually only needed 1 zip tie, I just used what was there. A square of 3M VHB on the back, and they worked great. I tested the lights once they were mounted in, and they are pretty bright. Probably too bright. I'll have to wire in a resistor to dim them a little bit. The side lights went in just fine, but the center light didn't line up with the holes. I added these holes to the tow hooks to mount the center light, and they just didn't line up. I'm not sure why. I did dimension this in CAD, so I either measured it wrong or typed it wrong. But it doesn't really matter. I fixed it with an end mill attached to a drill. Some of you were saying that I should be using a 2-flute end mill instead of a 4-flute since this is aluminum, but I would like to point out that using an end mill to side cut with the drill is pretty far from the correct use case anyway. And with that done, it was time to install the bumper. I figured it would be easier to get the fascia on after the bumper was installed, but it turns out you can't do that because the bull bar is in the way, so I took that off. This seemed like a good time to mount the hood release. The Viper hood opens from the back, but you unlatch it from the front. You have to pull this lever behind the crosshair opening, then you have to release the safety latch, lift up the front, then you go back and flip it forward. Anyway, the release lever attaches to that fiberglass bumper I got rid of, so I had to attach it to my new intermediate bumper. I did some final trimming of the fascia to make sure everything fits nicely and make sure the hood lines up with the top of the fascia. I do still need to add some supports to the side to lift up the fascia so it meets with the hood. The final piece of the puzzle was to put the bull bar back on. Unfortunately, those fasteners are kind of hard to get to with the bumper installed. Should have probably pressed in some captive nuts before I welded this all together. I thought about doing it the half-ass way and install it with a C-clamp, and then I remembered I put removable panels on the sides, so that was easy. And that was it. It is done, installed, and looking good. Now everyone knows that I am an actual off-road bro. I did notice about this time that hump I added to the middle to continue the crosshair grille was not exactly center. The whole bumper, in fact, is slightly shifted to the left, but it really only stands out when you look at this middle part here, so don't do that. Don't look at it. It's good enough. Certified good enough. By the way, these are the new stickers for patrons. Want a certified good enough sticker? Go join the Patreon, support the channel, help me pay for all these stupid things. Before I could roll the Viper out of the garage to get these excellent shots, I had to move the RV, which was parked in the driveway, blocking the Viper in the garage. This would be easy enough, except for the fact that the parking brake was rusted stuck. So much that the RV wouldn't even move. Normally, this doesn't happen in Southern California, but I decided to drive the RV through a literal lake of fully saturated salt water, and now everything is rust all the time, no matter how many times I try to get rid of it. We were about to take the wheels off and try to disassemble everything, probably with a sledgehammer, but first I decided to fix it by hitting it with a sledgehammer. And then we got in, dropped it into low gear, and mashed on the throttle. Problem solved. I rolled the car out, got some shots, and I realized I couldn't roll it back in by myself because I pushed it back to the steeper part of the driveway. Unfortunately, my friend had already left, so I did what any reasonable person would do, and I took it as an opportunity to test the newly installed tow hooks, and also the clutch on my motorcycle. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hail the AI algorithm overlords by liking and subscribing and all that other stuff. I'll see you next time for possibly a first drive.